Oh no, there's me. Okay, so in the municipal election of 1968, the Conservatives won 62% of the vote and 78% of the seats. They'd run Liverpool's municipal government for 86 years of the previous 100. Okay, so they were a hugely successful party. In many ways, they were the natural party of local government in Liverpool. In 1972, they lost control of the city council for the final time. In 1983, they lost their final 2 MPs. In 1994, they won their final electoral contest in Liverpool. So I was one. And since then, the Conservatives have never won an election in Liverpool. So today, Liverpool is a kind of byword for anti-Tory sentiment. Radio 5 Live in the 2012 mayoral elections reported that the Conservative candidate was beaten by a rival dressed as a polar bear. I was there. There was nobody was dressed as a polar bear, unless it was me and I forgot. But the Conservatives still finished 7th, and they got 4.5% of the vote. When we talk about Conservative decline in Liverpool, what we're really talking about, I argue anyway, 3 distinct periods in the city's political history. So a period of success up until roughly 1971, when the Conservatives did very well. It was a 2-party system by and large, and the Conservatives were often the biggest party. We talk about decline, which began in 1971, and that's something I'm going to outline later, and then a period of continued irrelevance from about 1987 onwards. And so this idea of either a continued Conservative irrelevance or a very quick decline in the post-war era, it's inaccurate. All of these kind of different periods as well can be explained by different phenomena. It's not one long-term trend, it's 3 very distinct reasons. Okay, so first of all, I just want to kind of put the nail in the coffin of the myth that Liverpool was always a no-go area for Conservatives. So this graph shows Conservative vote share in general elections from 1945 to 2001 for Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds and Newcastle. Liverpool's in red. So up until roughly 1964, the Conservatives outperformed all of these other cities. Okay, the Conservatives would get the highest vote share in general elections within the city, around roughly 53% in 1959. Then we see a period here between 1964 and 1983 where the Conservatives were still competitive and they were still kind of achieving similar vote shares than they were in other cities. And then after 1983, a kind of very sharp drop, especially in 1987. On the face of it, this does seem to kind of provide evidence for the idea that Thatcher is the cause of Conservative decline in Liverpool. But we can see that there's been, at least to some extent, an element of decline already. If you look at the averages, I mean, the Conservatives were hovering around 50% in the late 50s, early 60s, and it was in the 70s that the vote share started dropping on average. This slide, there's a lot of information on this, and I'm happy to talk through it later, but this essentially outlines the different constituencies in Liverpool. So a thick line here kind of represents boundary changes. So Liverpool started off with 11 constituencies, and in the landslide of 1945, they were mainly Labour. But the Conservatives by, don't know why that says 19, yeah, so by 1955, the Conservatives were winning in seats such as Toxteth, which if you've been to Toxteth today, is unthinkable. In Kirkdale, in Walton, of all places, voted Conservative. West Derby, Wavertree and Garston, like they were competitive in the city. They won seats. And we can see that the first watershed election came in 1964, where the Conservatives lost Toxteth for the last time. They lost Kirkdale, Walton and West Derby. They lost 4 seats, 4 out of 9. And then the next wave came in 1983 with the loss of Wavertree and Garston, both of which faced significant boundary changes. Where, so for example, in Garston, the constituency was reorganised to include Speke, which was a heavily Labour voting ward. I think 75% of people had voted Labour in the previous local election. And so seeing this, the 2 local MPs thought, bugger that, I'm off. The person for Garston went to, I think, Huyton, and the guy for Wavertree went to South Hams. So they got into other safe seats. So you had, reorganised constituencies alongside no incumbency bonus. And they lost those seats, but not massively, not massively. So 1964 was also kind of a bigger time of Conservative decline than 1983. So Thatcher's she might be part of the problem, but she wasn't necessarily the cause of the problem. We can see this again in vote shares in local government. So we can see again this period of Conservative success, and cyclical party support between Labour and Conservatives up until 1971. So, I mean, we're looking at 62% of the vote for the Conservatives in a local election. They would literally kill for that, I think, nowadays. Whereas Labour were down to something like 20-25%. Again, unheard of nowadays. So we can see between 1945 and 1970, the Conservatives do well when Labour do badly, party support cyclical, and usually influenced by things like national government. If the national government's Conservative and unpopular, the Conservatives get hammered in local elections. If the national government's popular and Conservative, local Conservatives tend to do well. Then we see a period of decline, quite a steep decline, starting in 1971. Again, unpopular Heath government. And this kind of continues, a period of kind of three-party politics, but actually the Conservatives get hammered by the voting system. First past the post is brutal to them, as is how their vote is distributed. So they pile up votes in the kind of well-to-do southern Liverpool wards, and this hammers them. The Liberals and Labour have much more widespread support across, so they get hammered. And then a period of kind of irrelevant, like who cares? You're nothing in this city anymore. To the point where they're getting beaten by a party, the Liberal Party, which rejected the Liberal Democrats, so it's its own splinter Liberal Party. And so they're getting beaten by non-entities, essentially. And this is just one final kind of, I'm going to say fun table. You might have different ideas of what constitutes fun to me, but we're all at a conference about Thatcherism, so none of us are cool. And this shows council control from 1945 to 2016. If they're shaded across, it's no overall control, but it's led by that political party. And to kind of paraphrase Beyonce, well, who run Liverpool City Council? Up until 1971, it was often the Conservatives. That was less of a hit. That was a B-side. And so we can see that, you know, up until the Labour, for the first time, control a council in 1955. Only Birmingham held out longer against Labour. But once they were in, they were obviously hugely successful. So what didn't cause Conservative decline in the city? Well, the first thing is there's no relationship between the organisational efficiency and Conservative strength in local government. Yes, the Conservative Party on the ground was quite bad in the post-war period, to the point where you had the leader of the Conservatives threatening the kind of Northwest regional officer, like he threatened to punch him, I think, because he wasn't given a New Year's honour. So like they're hot messes, essentially. But so is the Labour Party. And so organisational inefficiency doesn't make that much of a difference because everybody's rubbish. The parties are hollow and they're run as personal fiefdoms. The Conservatives consistently suffered with electoral bias throughout the period, so it's not as if the voting system suddenly worked against them in 1971. They were suffering with this problem all the way through. What I argue did cause Conservative success is, obviously Liverpool has a history of sectarianism, a strong kind of Irish Catholic population against what the kind of literature terms a Lancastrian Protestant identity. And the Conservatives, the traditional literature argues, rode on the success of this sectarianism, okay? This idea of bigotry, of playing up to the Protestant vote at the expense of the Catholics. There's not that much evidence, actually, that they specifically played to Protestant interests. What they did do was offer a policy platform that aligned with Protestant interests, so protection of the empire, protection of the church, things like that. And they did not discriminate, or there's no evidence at least that they discriminated against Catholics in the provision of social welfare. So the Catholics were not discriminated against in terms of housing, although they did tend to live in poorer areas. They were not specifically targeted in slum clearance. So there's this idea that the Conservatives played in Liverpool, at least played on these sectarian tensions, is iffy at best, and again represents a kind of received wisdom. But Protestantism is important in explaining Conservative success because of a process of socialisation. So what is socialisation? It's the process whereby an individual's beliefs, outlooks, and kind of like their values, who they vote for, are influenced by the environment in which they grow up and the environment in which they find themselves. Society socialises them into having certain values. We know this is important in voting behaviour in the UK. I mean, since like Butler and Stokes essentially found that children of parents who come from a Labour voting family are much more likely to vote Labour than those who don't. Yeah, it's kind of basic. It's almost common sense. And what I argue is essentially that socialisation, this Protestant identity, created an environment whereby your local area was conservative because they were Protestant, and this kind of path dependency socialised new voters into voting Conservative. In a city where if you kind of take a kind of class-based lens to apply to this city, shouldn't be voting Conservative, and certainly shouldn't be sending Conservatives to the council in 1969, 1970. The Conservatives shouldn't be running a city like Liverpool if you take a class-based analysis. And then there's also this idea of historical causes. So kind of show this in these two diagrams. The original success of the Conservatives, pre-war success, was down to Protestantism. You know, they aligned themselves with what Protestant voters wanted. And unsurprisingly, people voted for that. So Protestantism led to Conservative voters. Post-war, what happened was a little bit different. We have our Protestantism as our kind of historic cause. This leads to Conservative voters, which then leads to a Conservative area. Then you get young people who grow up in these areas that were quite strongly Conservative, and they get socialised into voting Conservative. And that produces Conservative voters, which then kind of the path-dependent model kicks in here, and Conservative voters create a Conservative area. This is not to kind of explain individual elections in individual wards, but it does, I argue anyway, it does explain why cities like Liverpool had a broad level of Conservative support. So if you think of it as like the ocean, underneath you've got your choppy waves of individual elections, but underneath those waves there's a calm body of Conservative voters. This was breaking down over time, but it was reinforced by things such as the local media. So this table shows who the Liverpool Echo, which is still going, is a kind of a tabloid, a local tabloid, and the Liverpool Daily Post, which served the kind of middle and business classes within the city. Up until 1959, both papers, which had a strong history of liberalism, endorsed the Conservatives. In the 60s, they were a bit iffy. 1974, in February at least, they endorsed the Conservatives. And the Liverpool Daily Post continued to endorse the Conservatives up until 97. Liverpool Echo, even in 1983, the Liverpool Echo endorsed the Conservative candidates. Now, if you've read the Liverpool Echo today, firstly, I'm sorry, and secondly, the idea that they would endorse the Conservatives is mad, and this idea that, you know, do the media structure people's voting behaviour, or do they follow it? You know, it's kind of classic with the Sun, it's the Sun what won it. Well, if they're putting forward a view that's so unpopular it would harm their sales, no local newspaper's going to do that. So there was just kind of more evidence that Liverpool was at least open to Conservative ideas, at least up until 83. So what happened in 1970, which is when I argue that decline began? So first of all, Heath led to an unpopular government, and what happened was voters, as we all know, in local elections, used them as a way to express dissatisfaction with the national government. So the local Conservatives got hammered. But previously when this had happened, when the Labour government comes in, this trend kind of reversed itself, and then people start punishing punish Labour, or Labour voters don't turn out. So 1971 saw Liverpool Conservatives' vote share drop to under 35%, which was the lowest it had ever been in the post-war era. They lost 24,000 votes in the city, and Labour voters turned out. The Liberals were also, they were on the ground, they were doing the kind of pavement politics, where they focus on things like potholes. They're probably a forerunner where you see councillors kind of squatting over potholes, looking sad and pointing. That's Liverpool Liberals kind of began that, almost. So you're welcome. And you had this idea that you had two local parties, Liverpool Conservatives and Liverpool Labour, that were both hollowed out. They weren't responsive to the needs of the city or of their voters, and the Liverpool Liberals were like a breath of fresh air. What they did do in this period, at least, was they would take Conservative voters overwhelmingly. Labour voters, if they were unhappy with a national Labour government in Liverpool, they wouldn't vote. They just wouldn't turn up. Conservative voters, people tended to vote Conservative at this era anyway because they were not Labour. And so if the Liberals looked like they could provide an alternative to Labour, they'd vote for the Liberals rather than not vote for the Conservatives or not turn out. So you had kind of strong switching to the point where in 1964, the Liberal vote was 10,000 roughly. In 1972, it was 24,000. So over double in just the space of 3 years. What I argue stopped this kind of cyclical pattern of party support in Liverpool between Conservatives and Labour is the 1973 election. So obviously, we all know the Local Government Act 1972, of course. But what it did was restructured local government in the UK, or at least in England and Wales. The number of wards in Liverpool was reduced from 40 to 33, and it abolished aldermen. And this meant that in 1973, the whole council was up for re-election, all 99 seats as they were then. Conservatives were hammered. Okay, so they get, in the steps, so they get 27% of the vote, but they only get 9% of the seats. First past the post hits them hard, whereas Labour and Liberals both get 35.4%. The Liberals get 48.5% of the seats. They're only like 3 short of a majority. And this is coming from no seats in 1967, or one seat. So you can understand like how much of a culture shock this is to Liverpool's body politic. But because the Conservatives were defeated and they were restricted to 3 wards now, the Liberals could present themselves as the alternative to Labour within the city. So this kneecapped the Conservatives and their kind of main appeal to a lot of anti-Labour voters, and like the rotting foundations of their support had collapsed. Okay? So this was a long, ongoing process, but what broke the previous socialisation pattern was this kind of all-out election that really, if it was a normal year, this would have only been 1/3 of the wards. And yes, the Conservatives would have had a bad election, but it wouldn't have changed the narrative of the city's politics in the way that an all-out election did. So it's massively powerful. But this is not quite what caused the relevance, I argue, anyway. So this shows Conservative vote support from 1987 to today with the mayoral elections and the metro mayor elections just for Liverpool. And the Conservatives struggle to get over 10%. And nowadays, the Liberals also struggle to get over 10%. And it's essentially Labour through and through. I argue that the reason, and this is common, I think, anyway, I want to do future research to test this out, but I argue that the cause of Conservative decline is not, it's not because of demographics. It's not because, you know, these people wouldn't vote Conservative anyway. There are wards that should be Conservative if you look at socioeconomic background. In any other city, or in most other cities, anywhere else, they would be Conservative. But why not in Liverpool? Well, I argue that actually the Scouse identity in the 1980s kind of inherited a form of anti-conservatism, anti-Thatcherism, but more broadly anti-conservatism, with kind of Heseltine being the exception that almost proves the rule. How come he's so loved in Liverpool? Well, because he definitely wasn't Thatcherite, as he said himself. And that's what I'm going to unpack in this second half. But it's okay, it's not halves in terms of time, because I realise I'm running over. So before we identify unpick the elements of a Scouse identity, I kind of want to outline some elements of the theory, at least. So Tadgefell and Turner in 1979 outlined their kind of social identity theory, and it argues at the crux of it that people have identities that they think give them a positive self-concept. No one's going to take, very few people at least, are going to take an identity that makes people hostile to them. They use identities as a way to feel good about themselves, as a way to boost their positive self-concept. Social groups or categories and the membership of them are associated with values, with connotations, either positive or negative, which contribute to an individual's social identity. And the evaluation of one's own group is often based against other groups. So positive comparisons between your group and another group or another tribe or whatever, however you want to kind of term these groups. Positive, your group looking better is good for you and it will make you feel better about yourself. Negative ones, your group's going to come off bad. You will have a negative self-concept. So if identities are used as a way to maintain or enhance your self-esteem, we can look at the case of Liverpool. In the 1960s, well, before that, the key identities were Catholic and Protestant. But over time, secularization, economic growth, things like that, the decline of the church, decline of institutions like the Orange Order, Orange Lodge, meant that meant that religious sectarianism became less important. This left a gap for a new identity, a kind of a non-sectarian identity of Scouse. Let's call it Scouse. This had been present, to some extent anyway, in the past, but it had never been salient. It'd been more of a descriptive label. Where are you from? I'm from Liverpool. What are you? I'm a Catholic. Yeah. Now it was becoming, what are you? I'm a Scouser. So at this point in the 1960s, anyway, this identity didn't have a political salience. It was important, but it wouldn't structure your voting behaviour, things like that. So kind of, what is Scouse? Well, first of all, the language, the accent, the dialect is important as a kind of instant membership rule. Okay, if you sound like you're from Surrey, you're unlikely to be considered a Scouser, at least on first reading. So for Crowley, Scouse became the index, not simply of Liverpool identity, but of, that's where he argues anyway, specifically Liverpool working class identity and of the real Liverpoolian. There's a geographical element. So for people outside of Merseyside, Someone might say, where are you from? I'm from the Wirral. And you go, oh, so you're a Scouser. And that might be fine if you're not from Liverpool, but if you are from Liverpool, you go, oh, you're a Wool. And the membership rules are fuzzy. So if you're from Liverpool, you're a lot more, or you're generally more exacting about who is a Scouser and who isn't. And this is confused by things such as like the kind of metro mayor as well, Liverpool city region. And if you ask someone from St Helens, do they feel part of Greater Liverpool? They'll say no. These things get quite passionate. Again, you can look at Ricky Tomlinson and Cilla Black. There was an article in the Echo a few years ago where Cilla Black said Ricky Tomlinson wasn't a true Scouser because he was born in Birkenhead. And then Ricky Tomlinson shot back saying, well, I might have been born somewhere else, but I've lived here since I was 3 days old. You buggered off down south, essentially. And then the Echo, in its kind of clickbaity way, put it to a poll. And while it was not, a statistically rigorous poll, 90% of people backed Ricky Tomlinson. Yeah. And I was going to talk about, if I had time, about a statue in Matthew Street of Cilla Black that people protested because Cilla Black she supported Thatcher. She was a Conservative. But funny enough, so was Ken Dodd. And the people of Liverpool love Ken Dodd. And do you know why? Because he never moved away. He stayed in Knotty Ash. And if you've been to Knotty Ash, you wouldn't stay. So he's shown loyalty to this Scouse identity. I really hope nobody is from Knotty Ash. Other elements, cultural. So in the 1960s, things running up. We had the Beatles. I wasn't born then. Beatles, Merseybeat theatre, comedians, TV success. Liverpool was cool, yeah? Especially with the Beatles. And here's a fun question, a little bit of Q&A, keep it interactive. In the 1960s, 4 of the top 5 selling singles were by the Beatles. Can anyone tell me who sang the 5th? And I'm really glad Stephen's not paying attention because he's a quiz fiend.
Jerry and Pacemaker?
No. No, was it? It was Ken Dodd. He did a cover of Tears, right? And so he's so multi-talented. It was the best-selling single in 1965, and the UK's 3rd best-selling single of the 1960s. Scouse was a cultural powerhouse. At least the BBC told me this. And it's in my thesis, so I really hope it's true. The city became known for its comedians as well, people like Jimmy Tarbuck, obviously Ken Dodd, and things like that. There's also sporting success, and sport was massively important to the Scouse identity because it provided people with non-religious identities that they could buy into, especially working class Liverpudlians. And unlike in places like Glasgow, where these teams were tied into a kind of religious identity, in Liverpool, it wasn't really that strong. There was some talk of Everton being a Catholic team, but it was never really kind of the experience on the ground. And this might be able to be traced back to the fact that both football clubs were started by the same Conservative councillor, John Halding, in the 18 whatevers. I don't really follow football. I'm not quite sure what it is, to be honest. There's also the economic revival in the 1960s. The city was enjoying a brief Indian summer of economic growth. There was lots of jobs. And nobody, well, Peter Kilfoyle, who was the MP for Walton, Labour MP for Walton, said like the city fathers, they had no idea what was coming. They thought that 1960s, this economic growth was the start of a new trend where Liverpool was resurgent. No, nobody knew what was coming. Kilfoyle says Liverpool was a great place to be. Economically, I could go from a job to a job to a job. And this helped to erode sectarian prejudice as well. And there was also, again, Kilfoyle argues, a kind of a time of broader cultural flux, both across the city, but across the country and possibly Western Europe. And this affected lots of attitudes, so religious attitudes, sexual attitudes, moral attitudes, everything. Okay, so if you think about the 1960s and this idea of Scouse identity, it's a way of getting a positive self-concept. It was a good thing to have. Being Scouse was cool. This changes massively in the 1970s and the 1980s, which saw Liverpool evolve from a symbol of the good times to the bad. So we have economic decline, and I'll fly through this, but I'm happy to talk about it later. Economic decline, unemployment had risen from 5% in the mid-1960s to 20% by 1981. In 1985, the Echo reported that almost 32,000 Merseyside youngsters were chasing just 112 careers. Again, it's the Echo, so I'm not quite sure what those statistics are based on, but it shows a stark level of economic decline. Thatcher once told Kilroy Silk, who was the MP for Ormskirk at the time, and obviously host of the popular show, both obviously Kilroy, but also Shafted. The problem with your constituents is that they don't start their own businesses. They've got no entrepreneurial spirit, they've got no get up and go. There was this framing of Liverpool's economic situation as a moral failing on behalf of its people, both by the Thatcher government and by certain elements of the print media. We had the 1981 Toxteth riots, which Heseltine talked about yesterday, and it was the first use of CS gas on the mainland. According to Boland, who's a kind of historian of the city, the chief constable of Merseyside connected the riots to pathological flaws in local people. He argued the true Liverpudlian possessed a turbulent character that was proportionally tougher, more violent, I would argue more handsome. This was carelessly linked to large-scale immigration from Africa, Ireland, China, and the Caribbean. So there's a racial element as well, and Liverpool's actually quite a white city. For talk of diversity and multiculturalism, if you look at the census, Liverpool's about 92% white. It was also connected with mob violence, hooligan behaviour, especially linked to football. So these things that were once popular, once a kind of bedrock of conservative identity, were now negative. Yeah, they were portrayed badly in the local media for a whole range of reasons. So Tadgell and Turner argue that if you've got a negative identity or your identity is associated with negative concepts, you've got three options. The first is individual mobility, where an individual leaves that group. Okay, so I could move to Manchester and say I'm a Manc. I could move to London and say I'm a Londoner. And I could leave that identity behind. You can't do that for a city of 400,000 people, 500,000 people. The second one is social competition, where you go, actually, we're going to beat you at your own game. You know, we're seen to be bad for these reasons. These other reasons are what constitutes a good identity. We're going to compete on those. So it would involve, in the Scouse case, taking on Manchester as a kind of northern economic powerhouse. So Liverpool would try and perform better. Or taking on the Thatcher government, but asymmetric power systems mean that's impossible. Liverpool's massive social deprivation at the time meant you couldn't take on other cities. The local economy just wasn't robust enough. So I argue anyway that Liverpool, or militant as a catalyst for this, use this social creativity route, which is a way you change the basis of comparison. And what they did was say, look, we're not going to be judged on Thatcherite ideas such as competition, such as neoliberalism, such as capitalism, competition. We're going to focus on other things. We're going to be proud of our solidarity, our community spirit, these things that in an age of there's no such thing as society, we're going to value as important. Now, I've got a hunch as well, but I've not been able to test this yet, that if you go to anywhere with a strong local identity and ask them, what does your local identity stand for? They're going to say solidarity. They're going to say, we look after each other when times get tough. No one's going to say, you know, well, I see myself as, say, Geordie, but bugger my neighbour. Like, this is a common thing. What I argue is different is that militants imbued this identity with a strong anti-Thatcherite. The context allowed this to happen, a strong anti-Thatcherite idea. And this was easy, essentially, for two reasons. One, there were no strong conservative voices in the city, apart from Heseltine, who only seemed to be successful because he wasn't being Thatcherite. And also because, oh dear, also because Liverpool saw itself as being victimised. So what can the Conservatives do? I want to offer some thoughts. What can the Conservatives do to bring themselves back in places like Liverpool? So I know we heard from Gareth yesterday, who's a councillor, a Conservative councillor in, again, what really shouldn't be a Conservative ward, but is, because of the hard work that gets put in. Can you do this across the city? Well, there's not that many people to put that effort in, and I'll show a slide later that kind of brings that home. But if the framework that I laid out is accurate, there's two things that Conservatives can do in situations to increase their vote share, and we've seen both of these in Scotland. The first is to find an issue, okay? Find a key cleavage in society that you can ride on. For the Scottish Conservatives, that was independent. You know, they did well because they said, we are the party of no, we're the party of unionism. And whereas other parties wavered, they didn't. Can you do that for Brexit in Liverpool? Well, the city voted to remain, okay? It was about 60-40 split, but this diverges in individual constituencies based on Chris Hemretty's estimations. There's no strong relationship between the Leave vote and Conservative support in the 2017 general election. This doesn't seem like a viable route for the Conservatives to take in Liverpool. If you look at the increase in the Conservative vote share between 2015 and 2017, there's a strong correlation between Brexit and the vote share. Look at that. Look at that R-squared value. People will kill for that. I've got to stop saying people will kill. But if we look at the scale of the increase, it's no more than 4 percentage points. And if you're going from 6% to 10%, you're still not winning an election in Liverpool, Walton, or Garston, Halewood. So Brexit's out. Brexit's done. That's not a way for the Conservatives to come back. What I argue, and I was a bit dismayed yesterday when Heseltine kind of poo-pooed the idea of a minister for Merseyside. Thanks for putting that question in, by the way. Because that's what I argue. We have Ruth Davidson, who's a strong personality, and she's, in many ways, the really successful 2017 Theresa May's team. Well, actually, that worked in Scotland. Ruth Davidson's team. Conservatives say, look, we know we're not important. We're just a vehicle for getting Ruth into power. She's the vote winner. They argue, and I would say we need. If we're serious about conservative resurgence, if the party's serious about conservative resurgence in Liverpool, we do need a minister for Merseyside. It doesn't need to be a minister, but it needs to be someone who's taking on the mantle of minister for Merseyside. Because when you've got your key politicians in Liverpool, so being Steve Rotherham and Joe Anderson, both Labour figures, whenever anything happens, they're the ones in the media, and there's no conservative rebuttal. The Conservatives seem to have written off the city. Before the 2010 general election, Chris Grayling, when he was Shadow Home Secretary, was made an unofficial Minister for Merseyside. And I really want to emphasise this point. Chris Grayling was not the answer. He will never be the answer to most questions. But he did really stupid things. So he opposed a tram system for Liverpool. He said that Man U's Gary Neville, who is quite open about his dislike of Liverpoolians, will be a good role model for local youths. Then later claimed he meant Jamie Carragher. And he also compared Speak with Baltimore from The Wire. So you can understand why there was no kind of blue sweep in 2010. But so what should a minister do? Well, he should put forward sensible policies to address the problems Liverpool faces. A serious conservative response to what does Liverpool do about its skills gap, about its poor transport infrastructure? What does it do about kind of failing neighbourhoods? How do we revitalise our communities and boost our poor health outcomes? How do we retain graduates? You graduate from the University of Liverpool and then you get on a train to London. Nobody stays. Why not? These big questions that the Conservatives should grapple with, but they don't. They should learn a lesson from the 1960s and 70s Liberal Party. They should engage with the local media. They should get their arguments out there rather than letting these narratives remain unchallenged. They should engage with local groups, local stakeholders, and they should fight for a seat at the table on the basis that, well, the government's Conservative / DUP, we're Conservative. We can get access in a way that Labour politicians can't. They should act as an opposition to Liverpool City Region Metro Mayor and Liverpool Mayor. And they should hold town hall debates. They should go into places where they never go, and they should put forward their point of view, and they should argue passionately. And this might not pay off. It might not work. But I think it will be a blueprint. And even if it doesn't work in cities like Liverpool, where it's so embedded in the identity, you're not going to change an identity. You can't just leave Liverpool and hope, oh, well, in 20 years, it'll switch back to being Conservative. Because this is embedded in the identity, and it's socialised now. To the point where people, there's actual arguments about can you be a Scouser and vote Conservative? And the kind of overwhelming consensus is no. But this has a broader problem for the Conservatives as well. Is because Liverpool is so safe, and increasingly Merseyside is so safe, Labour can kind of ship activists out to marginals like Wirral West, or what used to be a marginal. They can put them on a bus because they don't need to be fighting the streets of Walton because nobody's there. So the Conservatives did this in Sefton, one of the Sefton constituencies, where because Labour saw Conservatives knocking on doors, people with blue rosettes walking around Sefton, the Labour had to restructure their plans and start fighting the battles in Sefton, as opposed to sending their activists to Southport, which the Conservatives won. So I would argue actually quite strongly that a minister for Merseyside is necessary. Oh, whoops, sorry. So now the Conservatives, this was just too perfect. I woke up to seeing this. The Conservatives allegedly searching for candidates on the street in places like Liverpool. That's not true, actually. That's because I know some local Conservatives. But a group of 6 southern poshos literally searching the streets of Liverpool, asking Scousers if they want to run 3 days before the election is not a good look. And this is from Guido Fawkes. And in this case, at least, Guido's right. It's not a good look. So now the Conservatives are an electoral irrelevance in Liverpool. Their failure to win a single seat in 2017 general election, following from their poor performance in Liverpool City region mayoral election, marked 23 years of electoral failure in the city. In the 2016 local election, the Conservatives won 4% of the vote and no seats, which was, funnily enough, the same outcome achieved by the Liberals in 1967 in Liverpool. However, 7 years on from this, in a ray of hope to any Conservatives in the room, the Liberals took control of Liverpool's City Council. So I guess, anything is possible in Liverpool's municipal politics. Thank you.